As everything seemed on the brink of collapse, she remained unaware. It was 11 p.m. When the message arrived, "It's over between us." In that moment, she was with him, sharing laughter and whispering secrets into her lover's ear, completely blind to the fact that her world was about to be turned upside down. The smile on his face vanished the instant his phone buzzed on the table. Those words, blunt and straightforward, confronted her with a reality she was unprepared to handle. She felt as if the ground beneath her had given way, her heart racing and a bitter fear creeping into her throat. For months, she had been living a lie, juggling a double life, thinking she was in control, and believing the game was rigged in her favor. But now, everything was about to implode. She panicked at the thought of the consequences. Everything he had built, hidden, and risked for those forbidden moments could vanish in an instant. Her fear wasn't just about her betrayed husband, but about what would come next if he knew everything, if he had truly discovered it all. She knew her husband well. He was not one to be easily deceived, and the silence that preceded the message only heightened her terror. She considered calling, but her hands were trembling so much that her phone nearly slipped from her grasp. Sensing her sudden change, her lover asked what had happened, but she couldn't respond. How could she explain that all she had done was futile? That the security she found in his arms was just a fragile illusion? The real threat wasn't in being discovered, but in what would happen afterward. In her mind, countless scenarios played out: her husband confronting her, exposing her truth, and dismantling her life and reputation. But there was something else, something she feared more than her secret being revealed, something that, if he knew, would be the end for her. After all, when it seems like everything is lost, people do the unimaginable to protect themselves. And what would she do when faced with the unavoidable truth? Life in Philadelphia went on as usual, with its grey skies and cold autumn nights. The streets were filled with people absorbed in their routines and personal struggles. In this urban landscape, in a typical middle-class neighborhood, lived John and Emily Carter, a couple who appeared ordinary to neighbors and friends, a stable, comfortable pair. But as often happens, what people see is just the surface. John, 38, was a diligent and responsible man, often described as pleasant. He had grown up in Philadelphia and climbed the ranks to become a manager at a large construction firm, a position earned through years of dedication. He worked hard to balance his job and home life, but over time, routine, pressure, and exhaustion began to wear him down. John felt something was missing, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. The sense that life was passing him by as he watched from the sidelines gnawed at him, but he didn't know how to express it. Maybe it was the weight of his responsibilities, or perhaps it was the emptiness he felt each time he returned home, where his bond with Emily seemed more distant by the day. Emily, 35, was a sophisticated woman whose effortless beauty often drew attention. As a lawyer, she spent much of her time in meetings and courtrooms. To outsiders, Emily appeared strong and determined, someone who knew what she wanted in both her professional and personal life. But internally, she wrestled with growing discontent. She loved John, or at least she thought she did, but something had changed. Over the years, their marriage had evolved from passionate beginnings to a friendly, almost sibling-like coexistence. Romantic dinners had turned into dull discussions about work and bills, and the spark that once bonded them seemed to have faded. Emily felt stifled by a routine that was slowly suffocating her. It was during this period of dissatisfaction that she met Mark, a colleague who stirred emotions in her that had long been dormant. Mark was everything John wasn't: outgoing, charismatic, and brimming with confidence that drew people in. He was the kind of man who could make women feel seen and special, and for Emily, he reignited the thrill and passion she thought she had lost forever. What started as harmless flirting smiles exchanged during meetings and text messages that began with small talk quickly grew into more intimate conversations. Mark knew what he was doing, and Emily, though aware of the dangers, went along with it. She justified her actions by telling herself she deserved happiness, that she deserved to feel alive once more. Meanwhile, John continued his daily life, unaware of what was happening. He believed that problems in a marriage were typical, that every couple had their ups and downs. John consoled himself by thinking things would eventually go back to normal. He didn't notice the subtle shifts in Emily's behavior, like the night she stayed late at work or the way she smiled at her phone. He chalked it up to work stress, assuming everything would eventually smooth out. John disliked confrontation and avoided questioning her, choosing instead to believe that everything was fine. But things took a turn on a Friday night. John had planned a surprise for Emily, hoping to reignite the spark in their marriage. He booked a table at the restaurant where they had their first date, a place filled with fond memories. When Emily got home, John greeted her warmly and shared his plans for the evening. However, Emily hesitated. She didn't want to go, but she also couldn't reveal the real reason why. That night, she had already made plans to meet Mark. Trying to keep her nerves in check, Emily concocted a story about an important work meeting, something John, always understanding, accepted without a second thought. He smiled, reassured her they could reschedule, and let her leave. Emily walked out the door, a mixture of guilt and exhilaration washing over her. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but the thrill of being with Mark made her feel alive and desired. In that moment, the consequences of her actions were the last thing on her mind. She was caught in a web of lies, not realizing how far she was drifting from John and the marriage she once held dear. John, on the other hand, spent the night alone, reflecting on his relationship. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something inside him felt off. It was just a feeling, but it was strong enough to trouble him deeply. John had always trusted Emily and never had any reason to doubt her before, but that night left a sour feeling in his gut. He resolved that he needed to understand what was happening, to find out what was wrong. Maybe it was just his insecurities getting the better of him, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was that doubt that drove him to make an unexpected decision. John started to watch Emily more closely, doing so subtly so she wouldn't notice. Little details began to stand out: a perfume she hadn't used before, the messages she answered when he wasn't around, and the increasingly frequent work-related excuses. John felt his heart sink, though he tried not to assume the worst. Still, he knew he needed the truth. In the days that followed, John's patience was tested. He tried to act as though everything was normal, but his anxiety grew with every passing moment. He began to contemplate how to uncover the truth and confront her without arousing suspicion, though he dreaded what he might find. Torn between fear and resolve, John realized the only way to get answers was to investigate on his own. He started planning his next steps, unaware that he was on the brink of a discovery that would forever alter his life. The message he sent to Emily on the night she was with her lover would mark just the start of a painful journey filled with unexpected twists. The tension between John and Emily grew steadily, like a storm brewing on the horizon. Their marriage, once grounded in a predictable routine, became overshadowed by an uncomfortable silence. Emily, despite her efforts to maintain appearances, couldn't fully hide the change's excuses for late nights became common. Meetings with Mark grew increasingly perilous, and the guilt she once ignored began to weigh on her. Yet, she continued, almost entranced by the thrill her infidelity brought. Meanwhile, John pressed forward with his plan, acting carefully instead of impulsively. He started by asking subtle questions, aiming to better grasp Emily's schedule, the commitments she spoke of, and the colleagues she claimed to be with. Knowing he couldn't confront her without solid proof, he opted for a more discreet route. He hired a private investigator. John needed the truth, though he wasn't prepared for the impact it might have. His decision was made, and there was no going back. The weeks that followed were agonizing as John found himself caught between his desperation to uncover the truth and his fear of confirming his worst suspicions. He pretended everything was normal, but internally, resentment and heartbreak grew like a shadow he couldn't escape. On lonely nights, John replayed the happy memories with Emily in his mind, struggling to pinpoint when things had started to unravel. Was it something he did, or something he failed to do? The questions haunted him, but no answer brought any comfort. On the other side, Emily sensed a shift in John. He was more distant, more reserved, and his mind seemed to be elsewhere, but she chose to ignore it. She was so engrossed in her affair with Mark that her home life became a distant concern. The relationship with her lover had become her priority, the secret rendezvous, the forbidden moments. They awakened a part of her that had been dormant for so long. Still, there was something about Mark that made her uneasy, a discomfort that arose whenever he spoke of the future. Emily wasn't ready to face what their relationship meant, but she also didn't want to let go. The detective John hired was thorough, and it wasn't long before he started sending photos and detailed reports of Emily's secret meetings. The evidence was unmistakable. It was all laid bare. John's reaction to seeing his wife in another man's arms was overwhelming pain, mixed with a clarity he hadn't anticipated. The anger, betrayal, and humiliation all swirled in his mind, but something else troubled him even more than the pictures. John understood that Emily felt guilt, but why did she remain so detached and distant? There was still something he couldn't quite grasp. John then decided to confront her indirectly. He needed to see how far she would go with her lies. He began to mirror her actions, becoming colder, less present, and leaving her alone, allowing her to feel comfortable within her own web of deceit. John wanted to gauge how far she would carry the pretense before confessing. During this process, he noticed something disturbing. Emily seemed troubled by something beyond the affair itself. There was a tension in her eyes, a fear John couldn't quite decipher. The situation came to a head one Saturday morning. John was in the kitchen making coffee when Emily walked downstairs, visibly upset. As Emily struggled to juggle her double life, John readied himself for the inevitable confrontation. He had no knowledge of her pregnancy ruse, but he could feel that something major was on the verge of being exposed. It was like the stillness before a storm, and John was bracing for whatever was coming. The message he planned to send that night would not only mark the end, but would also usher in a truth that would change everything. The tension mounted, the truth was near, and when it finally surfaced, nothing would ever be the same. The night that would alter their lives arrived sooner than either of them had anticipated. The atmosphere in the Carter home was tense, almost as if the walls themselves could sense the strain in the air. Emily struggled to focus, her mind torn between her past actions and what she needed to do to escape her current predicament. She knew she couldn't continue lying indefinitely, but she also wasn't ready to face the truth. John, however, remained composed, almost detached. He had made up his mind, and nothing would sway him. Emily left the house that afternoon to meet Mark for what she intended to be their final encounter. Mark had started showing a side of himself that was unfamiliar to her, a side that frightened her. He was impatient, demanding a decision, and pressuring her to leave John once and for all. But Emily wasn't ready to make that leap. She craved the security of her marriage and the comfort her life with John provided. Mark, however, was done being the backup plan. He wanted all or nothing, and in her desperation, Emily resorted to the lie about the pregnancy. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. They were seated in his car, parked on an isolated street far from prying eyes. Mark, who had been tense until that moment, stopped and eyed her suspiciously. "What is it?" he asked, his tone colder than ever before. Emily hesitated but knew she had no other option. "I'm pregnant," she finally said, her voice softer than she intended. Mark sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, his lack of response only intensifying Emily's nerves. "Pregnant," he repeated, as if the word was foreign to him. Emily nodded, trying to keep her composure. "Yes, and the baby is yours," she added, her words hanging heavily in the air, filling the car with an almost tangible tension. But instead of feeling relieved, Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she watched Mark's expression shift. He didn't look happy or even surprised. Instead, he laughed, a cold, emotionless laugh devoid of any joy or relief. "You think I'm going to fall for that?" Mark said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Do you really think I'd believe a story like that? How convenient. You just pop up with this lie, thinking you can trap me." Emily tried to defend herself, but the conviction in her voice was gone. "It's not a lie, Mark. I'm telling you the truth," she insisted, but Mark wasn't willing to hear it. "Spare me your lies, Emily. If you think this will change anything, you're dead wrong. I'm not a fool." Mark's harsh response hit Emily hard. She hadn't expected that the man who had been her escape, her sanctuary, would now treat her like she was nothing more than an annoyance. "So what do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice cracking. Mark looked her directly in the eyes and said without hesitation, "You're going to end things with your husband, one way or another. As for this pregnancy, if it's real, that's your problem." Emily stepped out of the car, feeling as if the ground had been pulled from under her. The lie, which once seemed like a solution, had now become an unbearable weight. She needed a plan, a way to get out of this mess before it was too late, but all she felt was a deepening despair that made every step feel heavier than the last. Meanwhile, John was at home waiting. He knew Emily was out, but what she didn't know was that he had tracked her every move. Hiring the detective had only been the first step. John had learned far more than he ever wanted. He knew where Emily was, who she was with, and the nature of their relationship. But that wasn't what broke him. What truly pushed him over the edge was the extra information, something he had never anticipated: the lie about the pregnancy. The detective had uncovered everything, and John now knew that Emily had been trying to manipulate him. It was the final straw. When Emily finally returned home that night, she found John sitting in the living room, his face obscured by shadows. "We need to talk," he said, his tone unrecognizable, authoritative, almost threatening. Emily hesitated, her heart pounding as she sensed something was seriously wrong, though she didn't yet know the full extent. About what, she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. John stared at her for a moment, as if carefully choosing his words. About us. About what's been happening to our marriage. A chill ran through Emily. She knew she was being confronted, but she had no idea how much John had discovered. John, she began, but he cut her off. No, I know everything. His words struck her like a blast of cold water. I know about you and Mark. I know where you've been, what you've been doing, and I know about the pregnancy. Emily was paralyzed. She wasn't prepared for this and didn't know how to respond. All she could do was stare at John, waiting for him to say more, but he didn't. Instead, he stood and walked toward her, looking her directly in the eyes. Why did you do this, Emily? I've always treated you well, never wronged you, yet you lied, cheated, and then tried to manipulate me with a fake pregnancy. John's voice was filled with anger, but beneath it was a deep hurt. He wasn't just angry, he was heartbroken. Emily tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She was trapped in the mess she had created, and now all she could do was listen. You think I'm a fool, don't you? John continued, his voice growing firmer. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? That you could just use me like I was disposable? He laughed bitterly. Well, now you're going to listen, and you'll hear me out to the end. Emily felt as if the floor was opening beneath her. She had never imagined John could uncover everything, let alone so thoroughly and accurately. His every word was a painful blow to her already crumbling defenses. She struggled to keep her composure, but the truth was laid bare, with nowhere left to hide. John, I can explain, she stammered, her voice trembling, but John was in no mood for excuses. Explain what, Emily? That you chose to cheat rather than fix what was broken? That you preferred to lie instead of being honest with me? John was relentless, his gaze locked on hers, as if trying to glimpse the remnants of the woman he had once loved. You destroyed everything we built, and for what? To chase a fantasy? To feel alive again? And that fake pregnancy, what were you hoping to achieve? That I would just accept it without question? Emily felt tears welling in her eyes, but she stubbornly held them back. I was confused, she said, desperately trying to justify herself. I didn't know what to do. Mark was pressuring me and I didn't want to lose you. I thought. John cut her off with a sharp gesture. What did you think? That you could trap me with a lie? That you could keep up this charade forever? You don't get it, Emily. I could have understood if you'd been honest, but now, there's no going back. The silence that followed was stifling. Emily knew she had lost not just John, but also the control she once had over everything. The lie she had used to try to save herself had ultimately been her undoing. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John stayed quiet for a moment before responding. You're going to leave this house. You'll leave everything behind. I've already filed for divorce, and no, Emily, you're not taking anything, not money, not possessions. And as for the pregnancy, you know that lie won't help you now. Emily felt the weight of his words like an unappealable sentence. She wanted to fight, to defend herself, but she had no strength left. Mark was no longer an option. He had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with the lie, especially one that could cost him dearly. All Emily could think about was the emptiness looming before her, an abyss filled with loneliness and regret. John, on his part, was drained. He had imagined this confrontation countless times, but now that it had happened, all he felt was deep sadness. The anger had faded, leaving behind only a hollow emptiness. Emily, I loved you, he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. I would have done anything to save our marriage, but you destroyed it all with your lies and betrayal. There's nothing left to salvage. Emily wanted to scream, to beg for forgiveness, but she knew it was far too late. All she could manage was a feeble apology, so faint and insincere that even she didn't believe it. Sorry doesn't change anything, John replied, his voice a mix of exhaustion and resignation. It's too late for us. That was the last conversation they had as husband and wife. Emily knew she was defeated, that there was nothing more to say or do. And when John finally turned and left the room, she realized that the most painful chapter of her life had begun. The future that lay ahead was bleak, and for the first time, she found herself utterly alone, with no one to blame but herself. The silence that filled the Carter home after that night was almost tangible. Emily withdrew to the guest room, unable to face the reality that her marriage was truly over. She could hear John's footsteps downstairs, the sound of doors closing, and the faint noises of the house, which now seemed to echo his solitude. But beyond the silence was the heavy burden of the dilemma that now haunted her. With the pregnancy lie exposed and her affair with Mark unraveling, Emily felt trapped. Her career, built through years of hard work, now hung by a thread. If John chose to, he could reveal everything, which would mean the end of her reputation as a lawyer, a thought that terrified her. Emily had always been a woman in control, proud of keeping her life's reins firmly in her grip. But now, those same hands were empty, trembling as they faced the chasm that had opened before her. John, meanwhile, was struggling to process the remains of his emotions. The fury he felt during the confrontation had faded, but the hurt lingered, unyielding. He knew he needed to move on, but something still held him back from fully closing that chapter. His choice not to expose Emily publicly was partly a moral one. Despite feeling deeply betrayed, he didn't want to ruin the woman he had once loved. However, the question of how to handle the situation now weighed heavily on him. John knew he had to find a path forward, but determining what was just and fair was daunting. As the hours dragged on through that endless night, John considered the idea of confronting Mark. While he found no satisfaction in thoughts of revenge, he wondered if it might be necessary for some sense of closure. However, he understood that this path wouldn't lead him to the peace he craved. Mark wasn't the sole culprit. He had simply exploited a situation that Emily herself had set in motion. The real battle was within a conflict between his thirst for justice and his need to heal the deep wounds that had torn him apart. Emily, isolated in her room, pondered over the series of choices that had brought her to this point. She had always taken pride in her intelligence and her knack for manipulating circumstances to her advantage, but now she saw herself as the creator of her own downfall. The humiliation of being exposed, the loss of John's respect, and Mark's rejection all merged into a profound despair. She realized there was no way to turn back, but she also wasn't ready to face the consequences. Every choice she made during her betrayal now felt like a misstep, a frantic attempt to escape a life that had gradually lost its meaning. The moral conflict they both confronted was, in many ways, a mirror of the complexities of love and deceit. John had to choose whether to take a harsh approach, punishing Emily for her actions, or to let her go, allowing her to bear the burden of her decisions. Meanwhile, Emily was forced to reckon with the destruction she had caused and to contemplate whether rebuilding her life was even possible. As the hours passed, the darkness of night slowly gave way to the grey of dawn. Emily knew she couldn't stay in that house much longer. John's presence, even in silence, was a constant reminder of the hurt she had inflicted. She needed to make a choice, but neither path seemed any less painful. The real question was how she could find a way to redeem herself, or at least survive the weight of her own actions. John, sitting on the living room couch, stared blankly ahead. He was aware that the decision he made in the coming hours would shape not only Emily's future but his own as well. There was a kind of justice in tearing her life apart, but there was also a heavy cost, one he wasn't sure he was willing to pay. It would be easier to let her go, but doing so would mean forfeiting the revenge he felt she deserved. More than just the end of their marriage, it was a matter of principles, of morality, and of how they would both handle the consequences of their actions. The dilemma was clear, and whatever choice they made would bring outcomes neither of them could fully foresee. The morning broke cold and foggy, mirroring the heavy atmosphere inside the Carter home. Emily had spent the night awake, haunted by the decisions she had made and what was about to unfold. She prepared to leave, knowing this would be the last time she would walk through the door as John's wife. Every movement felt unbearably heavy, filled with a sense that something dreadful was looming. Yet, she gathered what little remained of her dignity, picked up her suitcase, and made her way downstairs. John was in the kitchen, gazing out the window at the empty backyard, an untouched cup of coffee on the table. He didn't look at her when she entered, but he sensed her presence. There was a distance between them that felt insurmountable. Emily opened her mouth, searching for something to say, anything that might soften the tension between them, but the words died before she could speak them. Instead, the silence spoke volumes. John finally turned to face her, seeing a woman broken by her own actions, stripped of the lies and manipulations that once served as her armor. "Do you have anywhere to go yet?" he asked, his voice calm but devoid of the anger that had defined their earlier confrontation. Emily nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "I'll stay in a hotel for now, then figure out what to do." There was nothing left to say. John merely nodded, and silence once again filled the house. He didn't wish her well, nor did he ask her to stay. They both understood that this was the end, and any attempt to soften their parting would only be another falsehood. As Emily stepped out of the house, she felt a strange mix of relief and despair. Relief came from knowing the confrontation had finally ended, but despair sank in as she realized she had lost everything. Emily got into her car, started the engine, but didn't drive off immediately. She sat there, motionless, allowing herself to cry for the first time in what felt like ages. Yet, the tears brought no solace, only a growing emptiness with every sob. Meanwhile, John, still in the kitchen, took a sip of his coffee. It was cold and bitter, but he didn't mind. He had made his decision and was confident it was the right one. There was no longer room for bitterness, only for the slow and challenging journey of healing. What John didn't anticipate was that this morning would bring one last twist. Hours later, already settled at the hotel, Emily received a call from Mark. She answered with hesitation, knowing she could no longer avoid the conversation she had been dreading. "We need to talk," he said bluntly. "I'll be at the hotel in an hour." Emily knew that her relationship with Mark was coming to an end, but she hadn't expected the coldness with which he would deliver the final blow. When Mark arrived, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "It's over, Emily. I'm not doing this anymore," he declared. She tried to argue, but Mark remained firm. "There's no future for us. You've known that from the start. I'm not risking my life for a lie you created." Emily was left speechless, her face pale and her hands trembling. Without a hint of empathy, Mark got up to leave, pausing at the door to deliver one last blow. "Mind your own business, Emily. I've already moved on with mine." Meanwhile, John started to rebuild his life with a surprising sense of calm. The divorce proceedings were swift, as Emily, unable to resist, accepted all his terms. John sold the house and relocated to another city, seeking a fresh start away from the memories of his past. He wasn't happy, but he felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that the worst was behind him. Emily, now alone, without Mark, without John, and without the support of her old life, fell into a deep depression. She lost her job, her friends, and was left to face the full impact of her actions head-on. Stripped of resources, dignity, and burdened by guilt, Emily was forced to move back to her parents' home, something she had never imagined she would have to do. There, she confronted the shame and humiliation of having to rebuild her life from scratch. John's path, in contrast, was more favorable. Over time, he found the strength to move forward, dedicating himself to his work and piecing his life back together in a new city, far from the shadows of his past. Gradually, John began to find the peace he had been searching for, fully aware that the healing process would be long, but determined to continue on this path. The end came unexpectedly for both. Emily, consumed by her own downfall, was never able to recover what she had lost. John, on the other hand, managed to free himself from the weight of his past, although the pain would never fully leave him. And so, the cycle concluded, leaving both trapped in the consequences of their choices. What remained was silence, heavy with the bitter truth that some wounds never truly heal.